Next up today we have E.J. McMahon, who's the president of the Empire Center for Public Policy. Mr. McMahon, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The notice for this hearing is appropriately focused on the core question you need to consider in weighing Governor Cuomo's proposal. And that question, of course, is what impact would such a policy have on workers, employers, and the economy as a whole? I really think that's the question that needs to be carefully considered. I'm going to suggest to you in my testimony that I think there's some compelling evidence in support of the following answer. On balance, a mandated $15 an hour minimum wage would be a counterproductive policy with a negative impact. It would disrupt labor markets, reduce job creation, drive up prices, and chill the business climate. Now, as far as individual New Yorkers are concerned, I would suggest that the negative effects will be felt, ironically, most strongly by the very people this policy is supposed to help, and who I believe you want to help most, which is marginal, younger, low-income workers struggling to get or keep a foothold in our economy. On a geographic basis, the negative impacts are likely to be disproportionately concentrated in upstate New York, and will be worst of all, ironically again, in those upstate regions that are struggling most to retain and create jobs. My organization recently co-sponsored research to estimate the impact on employment of this policy, but before getting into those findings, I would like to create some context for this discussion, which I think is relevant to some things said earlier also. And there's some charts attached to my testimony that illustrate this. The historical path of the minimum wage, federal and state, adjusted to $2015, begins in 1938. The first federal minimum wage, which applied to a very narrow group of industries, actually, by today's standards, was in those terms 25 cents an hour, which in today's dollars is $4.20 an hour. During a 25-year period that coincided with the great post-war economic boom, the federal minimum wage, and this is in the 1950s until about 1970s, was steadily raised in stages and hit the equivalent of more than $10 an hour by the end of the 1960s. New York's minimum wage peaked in 1970 at the 2015 equivalent of $11.35 an hour. Over the last 50 years, New York State's minimum wage in today's dollars has averaged a little over $8.30 an hour over the last 50 years. By the way, if you stretch the comparison back 60, it's only very slightly higher. The current New York the current New York minimum wage of $9 an hour is the highest New York minimum wage in 37 years, adjusting for inflation. Even discounting for future projected inflation over the next 6 years of 2.5% if the budget division is correct, assuming the same phase-in schedule adopted by the Wage Board for fast food workers, a statewide minimum wage of $15 an hour in today's terms as of 2021 would still easily be the highest in New York's history. A minimum wage of $15 an hour would be considerably higher than the minimums now scheduled to take effect over the next several years in our adjoining states. And while some cities elsewhere in the country, such as Seattle, have enacted local laws that have begun moving them up to a $15 an hour minimum wage, with some exceptions, such a policy has not been enacted on a statewide basis anywhere. As illustrated in Figure 2, adjusting for exchange rates and purchasing parity differences, $15 an hour is higher than the current minimum wage in countries around the world. Indeed, as of 2014, only 7 of 25 developed nations had minimum wages higher than $9 an hour, and none had minimum wages higher than $12. Most pertinent of all, from your standpoint in weighing this proposal, are the very wide differences in prevailing market wage levels in different regions of New York State, which, since you all know New York well, is largely reflective of the very wide differences in living costs in different parts of the state. Based on Labor Department data, as shown in Figure 3 attached, the median hourly wages for all jobs in different New York regions are lined up against $15 as well as last year's $8.75. Those medians range from a high of just under $22 an hour in the New York City metro area, which in the Labor Department's definition includes White Plains and Wayne, New Jersey, to a low of $15.30 in the Glens Falls area. Other upstate regions with median wages just above $15 an hour included Utica, Rome at $15.91, the non-metro part of Capital Region, Northern New York at 1577, Central New York at 1559, and Southwest non-metro New York, that would be out in the western tier, at 1549. Even assuming these medians move in tandem at the same rate projected for total statewide wages over the next few years, a statewide minimum wage of $15 an hour would represent a very high percentage of the current hourly minimum wage throughout upstate New York, especially, again, in those regions such as the southern tier that have struggled most to create jobs. Which brings me to our own study. The authors of that paper, economists Douglas Holtz-Aiken and Ben Giddis of the American Action Forum, drew on 3 credible research models to estimate low, medium, and high impacts from raising the statewide minimum wage to $15 an hour, and the complete paper is attached to my testimony. Their key finding, as further explained in the paper, is that a $15 minimum wage phased in on the wage board schedule in different regions of the state could cause our job creation totals to be $200,000 lower at a minimum under the low impact estimate. And that depending on which other methodology was applied, and there's more details of those in the paper and even in my written testimony, the job impact could be as much as 432,000 jobs, or even in the high impact estimate, 588,000 jobs. Job losses would be smaller, but still more than New Yorkers should be willing to tolerate if the state was to set the minimum at $12 an hour, according to Holtz-Aiken and Gibbs. By the way, Doug Holtz-Aiken was unable to be here today. Unfortunately, we were unable, on the notice provided, to bring some of these economists into town, but would welcome a chance to do that some other time. Conversely, wage gains from the minimum wage would range from a high of $10.6 billion, that is, with the lowest job loss, it would be the highest net wage gain, $10.6 billion, to a low of just over $1 billion if the very high job loss estimate turned out to be correct. Based on national labor force data, our paper also estimated that less than 7% of the wages generated by a $15 wage would actually go to households in poverty. Now, advocates have suggested that a 67% boost in the minimum wage, which is what you're considering now, will ignite a purely virtuous cycle in which low-wage workers spend all of their higher pay on goods and services, resulting in a net boost to the overall economy. But there are 2 sides to that coin. A minimum wage won't generate higher incomes out of thin air. In fact, to a great extent, it will redistribute incomes, in some cases from one group of low and minimum and medium wage people to another. Consider how the $15 an hour wage scenario is likely to play out in just one important sector that touches many working families across the state. As of 2014, there were 11,370 child care workers employed in the 11 metropolitan areas of upstate New York, earning hourly median wages ranging from $9 an hour in Binghamton to just below $11 an hour in Ithaca. The biggest urban metros in upstate New York all had median child care worker wages below $10 an hour. That's as of 2014, median hourly wages. Now, obviously, in addition to being obviously important, child care is labor intensive, and licensed child care centers are subject to strict staffing levels. You can't automate child care. Given the figures I just cited, the imposition of a $15 an hour minimum wage inevitably will result in significant increases in child care costs for hundreds of thousands of parents at all income levels, some of whom are actually receiving government subsidies paid through nonprofit associations, which are a whole other area of discussion here. Mm-hmm. A significant raise for those 11,000 child care workers, and it would be, will require a significant increase in child care expenses for hundreds of thousands of parents and families. And as salaries rise for child care workers employed in licensed facilities, which is really what this count involves, families with informal child care arrangements also will need to pay more because of the prevailing wage increase. The most common assertion we hear in connection with the push for the $15 minimum wage, as Governor Cuomo has put it, is no one who works full-time should live in poverty. And of course, few would disagree with that. In fact, this is not a new concern in New York State. It was a desire to boost low-wage workers out of poverty that inspired Governor Mario Cuomo to successfully propose and initiate 22 years ago New York State's own supplement to the federal Earned Income Credit, a program that has enjoyed broad bipartisan support in Washington since the mid-1970s. By the way, the Earned Income Credit, as its name implies, is not public assistance. It is earned. It's related to work. For the single parent, let's count what the EITC amounts to. Counting the EITC and other state and federal wage supports and tax benefits, including child tax credits, which are refundable, but which go to all middle class and working families, as well as supplemental nutritional assistance, better known in the past as food stamps. A single parent of 2 children employed full-time in New York at $9 an hour can collect total cash income of just under $35,000 a year, which works out at a 40-hour work week to $16.81 an hour. These figures do not include any additional benefits such as housing and child care subsidies or health insurance under Medicaid or the ACA. For the single parent of 2 in that example, a $6 an hour pay raise would result in a net cash income gain, when all is said and done, of $2.72 an hour, due to the phase-in reduction of the EITC and other means-tested cash supports I just mentioned. Now, it's one thing for this offset to occur in the course of a low-wage worker's natural progression up the pay ladder. It's quite another thing to assume that the only way to boost the incomes of these particular workers, who, keep in mind, make up just a subset of all minimum wage earners, is by forcing employers and their consumers across the state to pay billions of dollars more to a much larger number of workers, most of whom have family incomes well above the poverty line, in fact, multiples of the poverty line. If poor workers are your real concern, and they ought to be, by far the most efficient way to help them is through improvements and restructuring of the Earned Income Credit, which, to be sure, really is going to require some cooperation or waivers from the federal level as well because of the way the Earned Income Credit flows now. Because the Earned Income Tax Credit encourages poor heads of household to seek work without jeopardizing employment opportunities for anyone else. Now, you've heard it implied, and I guarantee you will hear it implied and stated by some witnesses following me, that economists throughout the nation, if not the world, have somehow now reached a broad understanding and consensus that increases in minimum wages have no negative impacts anywhere, anytime on employment. Let me stress, that's simply not true. Last month, for example, Professor Clemens at UC San Diego, who is one of the authors of one of the methodologies cited in our paper, published new research findings that recent federal minimum wage increases had reduced employment among young workers. His findings were not inconsistent with research published in 2012 in the Cornell University ILR Review, which found that New York's 2004 increase in the minimum wage was associated with a reduction in employment of less skilled, less educated workers. Now, economists are going to continue to disagree on the strength and significance of employment impacts from minimum wage increases. That is guaranteed. But in today's New York context, by far the most important takeaway from the ongoing debate in this field is this: the vast majority of minimum wage research published by academic economists on all sides of this issue has focused on wage hikes that were much smaller and much more limited in scope than what you are now being asked to approve in New York State. In fact, prominent economists otherwise sympathetic to calls for a higher federal minimum wage have pointedly declined to endorse calls for an across-the-board wage floor as high as $15 an hour. To cite just one, Professor Alan B. Kruger of Princeton University, former chairman of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, recently wrote in the New York Times that, and I quote, "A $15 an hour national minimum wage would put us in uncharted waters and risk undesirable and unintended consequences," unquote. As Professor Kruger concluded in his column, quote, "Economics is all about understanding trade-offs and risks.
I guess that's right.
The trade-off is likely to become more severe and the risk greater if the minimum wage is set beyond the range studied in past research. In sum, a $15 an hour statewide minimum wage in New York would entail some very big trade-offs, affecting the livelihoods and finances of millions of New Yorkers, some positively, others negatively. In a prolonged period of slow economic growth, such as the one we're now in, the loss of any jobs, much less a possible minimum shortfall of a couple of 100,000 jobs, is a risk you should not be willing to take. The research we've published and the work of other organizations and economists indicates that enacting the biggest increase ever in New York's minimum wage would indeed benefit many low-income workers, that is, those who still have work or can find it, at the expense of others, those who can or don't. The biggest losers in this equation will ultimately be stuck with the ultimate minimum wage, which is zero. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you. I appreciate it. You know, part of the concern that I have, and before I get started, you made references to a median wage.
Right.
Describe that for us.
Well, the median wage is the halfway point. 50% of the people make less, 50% make more.
Right. So when we're talking about a median wage in an area like Binghamton, Southern
Right.
Tier,
Right.
1540 something, I think is
Right.
what you said. That means that half of the population in that area that's working is earning less than $15.40 right now. The other half is earning more than $15.40.
As of 2014, that's what they were.
So the prospect of a minimum wage increase and the effect on the business community in that area is something obviously that is of concern. Now, in preparation for this and for other discussions that we've had, I think we've all had opportunities to, I hope we've all had opportunities to research the issue of the effect of a median wage on minimum wage and what that ratio should be. But to the extent that perhaps we have it, where is that norm expected to be?
Well, it's one of those countless areas in where the economists you can consult disagree. A lot of advocates of higher minimum wages on the federal level think that it should be back in the neighborhood of, I think, 60% of the full-time wage. In fact, advocates of this higher wage believe that the minimum wage should be related solely to the full-time, full-year wage rather than the wage for all jobs. I would disagree. I would say wages are wages, and in fact, many of the jobs we're talking about, many of the workers we're talking about, in fact, it's roughly 50-50, a little more on the positive side, are not full-time and maybe are not depending on and supporting a family on the wage. There's a whole mix of people in this. So the norm is what you think it ought to be, but let me point out one thing. Professor Kruger is one of many people, I'm not going to speak for him, but he's made his viewpoint very clear, and there are others to be cited in addition to him. Among those advocating a higher minimum wage in the federal level, much higher than $7.25, including those who have done the work most of the advocates in this room have cited in the past in favor of some high multiple of a full-time wage, have also suggested, and there's not unanimity on this, some would disagree, that there is some greater ability to absorb higher wages in wealthy areas than there is in less wealthy areas. That in fact, minimum wages should, if you set minimum wages at some multiple of the median wage, say even the median full-time wage, what you'll quickly find is it's going to differ by state, for starters. Secondly, again, I don't have to tell you, New York State itself is very diverse. So by that analysis, you should also be looking at having a differing wage within New York State. And that is something that no one has paid attention to. In fact, one of the surprising things about this proposal, which in its dimensions is completely unprecedented, would be you have never been presented with any proposal like this before, is how it is completely oblivious to very significant differences and disparities in labor markets and wage levels across the state, which vary widely, as the figures I've cited indicate. So the answer to your question is it's whatever you want it to be. There are people who try to make a case for it to be at a certain level, but even those analysts, and I could send you citations to them, who favor a higher federal minimum wage pegged at some level, acknowledge differences among states, and in fact have not called for a $15 minimum wage.
No, I appreciate that. You know, I know that there are well-respected, learned economists out there on various areas of the spectrum. But whether it's Professor Newmark or Professor Kruger or Professor Holzer, all people who have, frankly, advocated for minimum wage increases, they've also all warned that it is the amount of this increase and the incremental increase as large as these are, because what I've seen, and I'd love to hear your comment on this, is we're talking about phasing this in over 3 years or 6 years if we're going to use the governor's model. If we're going to use the governor's model that he has used so far for fast food workers, that he has used so far for state workers, that he has used so far for SUNY. So I'm assuming that the governor is going to continue to be consistent. And let me take the opportunity to lament the fact that although we're here discussing the minimum wage and here discussing a concept, and although we invited the commissioner to be here today and representatives to the governor to be here today, they chose not to be here. So we will go and we will extrapolate off what he's already done in order to conceptualize the discussion here today. Because it would have been better if they had had somebody here and they could have clarified it for themselves. But historically, in New York and elsewhere, when we talk about phasing in minimum wage increases, even those we did here in 2009, they were phased in small amounts. And that seems to be the traditional way of handling minimum wage increases. Even as far back as you go, you see that those increases typically are significantly less than $1 an hour increases per year, but certainly not multiple dollars. And what we're discussing here is multiple dollar increases. What is the effect of that?
Well, I mean, you'll get varying opinions on that. I would simply observe that what the schedule of the wage board had was $1 an hour every year for, I think, 4.5 years or 4 years. I don't have it in front of me, culminating in then 75 cents and 75 cents or something.
Statewide. New York City is
Statewide,
significantly
dollar a
higher.
year, dollar a year, dollar a year, dollar a year. New York City different. So every year you'd have in nominal terms a bigger minimum wage increase than you ever had before. Now, I've heard it argued that, well, that should ease the pain upstate. I would suggest that really, you're really comparing strangulation to sort of beheading. I mean, we won't do it all at once. We'll kind of slowly squeeze. Let me use the example of the specific sector I cited, which is relatively small, but which is very important to working families, childcare workers. So you have childcare workers whose median wages now in the most populated metro areas upstate are under $10 an hour. And you're going to, in stages, every year increase the minimum by $1 an hour every year for several years in a row. What do you think that does to childcare bills and costs for people paying for it each and every year that it happens? Now, that's quite aside from the point. A lot of what you've heard today is about whether people deserve a higher wage or should get a higher wage or whether we should value work in a different way. But I'm talking about the basic hard market consideration here is the money does not come from nowhere. You have people who earn a particular wage in a particular industry that's at a level we now know that is going to have to go up very significantly each and every year for a number of years. The fact that it's over, it certainly would be a calamity if it went up 67% all at once, but it's still unprecedented, even under the schedule the wage board has adopted. It's still unprecedented. And in fact, the chart I gave you, I think figure 1 or 2, shows, if you just look at the scale of it, even compared to the very significant run-up in the federal minimum wage during the boom, during the 50s and 60s, which was this sort of concentrated period of minimum wage increases. It's bigger than that, and a bigger increase in a shorter time. So I just think, I would like to add one thing to some remark you made, Senator. You were talking about the business community. I'm not here to talk for or express concern about, quote unquote, the business community. There are other people here to do that. The point, in fact, of the research we co-sponsored, and the point I'm trying to make here today is that you ought to be concerned about individual workers and about employment opportunities in New York State. Forget about the businesses. Those come through the businesses. And I'm not saying you should disregard the interests of business, but the point is, businesses will speak for themselves. I'm talking about, you ought to be thinking about workers and opportunities for workers and how counterproductive this will be for workers, especially the workers who are supposed to be most benefiting from this.
And we'll have representatives from the business community. We'll also have representatives from the not-for-profit community who will also be testifying later today, and they can get into those particulars. But you mentioned the earned income tax credit and the ability that we have here in New York to directly assist people who are working, as opposed to a safety net program, as opposed to other forms of public assistance, that there is a route already in place or a program in place that will actually put more money in people's hands. Because that's really part of this, is how do we give people the ability to support themselves and on the other hand, weigh the impact to the job creators out there. And if there's a way of more directly putting money in people's hands as opposed to perhaps impacting or devastating certain employment sectors in this state, you mentioned earned income tax credit
Right.
as a means of doing that. How would we do that?
Well, there's no question that the way to most directly and efficiently concentrate more resources on low-income workers is to, and without affecting hiring patterns and opportunity, is through the earned income credit. And again, you can go to his article, not to be just cite one guy among many. That was Kruger, among others, made that point also. Many economists, some who think there's an impact and some who think there's not, have all talked about how the earned income credit is the way to concentrate most efficiently added income to people who are in low-wage jobs. Now, that's not to say, to a surprising degree, the earned income credit has not been sufficiently examined and revisited by researchers. There's a paucity of research on how to improve the earned income credit. One big problem with it is it's paid, the limits of the program are such that it is paid once a year. People have to go to tax prep, file their tax return, and then get a check for several $1,000s. And then the child credits are part of that. If there was a way to somehow, there have been experiments that have been sort of 50-50, if there was a way to somehow make it, to run it regularly through somebody's paycheck, which the ACA mechanism on insurance may actually have created an opening to. Perhaps New York could even pilot a program. There's one big problem here also. Our EITC, about which we've written in favor in the past in my organization, is 30%, is geared as 30% of the federal level. We spend $1 billion a year on that program. The federal EITC, thus it's based on that structure. So we'd have to change our definition, and there would be a budget outlay increase for that. Although, when you start hearing from nonprofit industries about how much it would cost just them to even, many of whom haven't caught up with the $9, much less 15, the figure won't look as big as you think. The federal minimum EITC is geared generally, in a general way, to the federal minimum wage, so it doesn't actually peak. It's kind of out of joint with places with higher minimum wages now. I think a lot of interesting work could be done in figuring out how to enhance the minimum wage. The President Obama has spoken about enhancing the EITC for single individual workers, which is almost nothing at the moment. And there's been a lot of thought, and again, potential bipartisan support for doing that. And also for sweetening it for married couples who don't get arguably sufficient benefit from it now. So that's kind of where the thought is. I think a lot of work can be done to examine the EITC in more detail and figure out how to make it more effective.
Of the jobs we have here in New York State, can you tell me roughly, if you know, what percentage are from small businesses, what percentage are from large businesses? To the extent that you do.
Offhand, I forgot to research that. I'm sorry. I'm sure subsequent witnesses will know it. A lot of low-wage jobs, obviously, are with small businesses and small firms. And the general economic understanding is that profit margins and operating margins are thinnest in small businesses and the types of businesses that employ low-wage workers.
When we discuss these issues, there are people who will discuss these issues and think of the large stores, the multi-billion-dollar corporations, whether they're fast foods or whether they are, the Walmarts or the Home Depots or the Lowe's, or you fill in the blank. When I discuss this issue, I think about the shop at the corner at the end of my block. And so it contextualizes these issues for me because, someone put a figure to this, and I think it actually may have been the governor, that this will put $15.6 billion into the economy.
Right.
But this isn't $15.6 billion that wasn't already in the economy. This isn't new
Right.
money. This is money that is coming from somewhere else.
Right.
And to the extent that there's an argument that's going to be made that that money is coming from large retail, multi-billion-dollar companies, there's a discussion. And so I would like to focus on, and perhaps it's not with you, perhaps it'll be with somebody else, if you don't wish to comment on it, but the amount of money that comes from those small businesses, frankly, those people whose kids are going to school with my kids and who own businesses locally, is a real concern, because they're no longer going to have the money to spend, and they were spending it. So how do we deal with that?
Well, I mean, I don't think, for instance, that the idea of somehow doing some tax trade-off and we'll make it up to them in the back end, should be a non-starter, because you're talking, wages are part of your gross above-the-line expense. Taxes are a sliver of your operating margin, which in the case of many of these businesses is very small. The cost of the higher minimum wage for many of these businesses will be probably hundreds of times more than any savings from any conceivable tax, in fact, hundreds of times more than you pay in tax. I think that it is ironic that much of this discussion has taken to sort of objectifying big multinational, even global chains, such as McDonald's, as the so-called sort of supposed evildoers who are taking advantage of and exploiting low-wage labor. When in fact, if you implement a policy like this, like all labor regulations of all sorts, the employers that are best situated to deal with it absorb it, and after, whether or not they fend it off, surviving, are big employers. At the end of the day, you will end up with more retail, more service, more food service being done by and owned by chains, the bigger the more likely, than by community businesses if you do this. There's no question about it.
So if I have a local hardware store and I have a Home Depot, and this goes into effect, what you're suggesting is a year or 2, 3 years down the road, my locally owned, small business owned hardware store is out of business and Home Depot is still there.
Well, think about that, and there have been research on this and been substantial studies about it, but just from your own experience. When a Walmart or a Home Depot comes into a community, the first thing that happens is the guy with the local hardware store freaks out because he thinks, well, that's it. They sell rakes for half of what I do. Then what happens is they realize they keep a lot of their business. They certainly keep me, because when you walk in and you're not sure what size bolt to buy, the guy you've known for years walks you down the aisle and says, you take this one instead of this one, whereas somebody in Walmart doesn't know anything if you can find them. So the local business survives on the basis of the service it provides, which equates to the people it employs. The Home Depot Walmart model is much less intensive in terms of employment, and of course is spread across a much bigger base of capital support than the local hardware store owner who maybe has the Ace franchise. And those are just that type of business. Clearly, you don't need to, this is based on your own experience. You can figure out what will happen here. This makes it that much harder on the individual, the small employer or the employer with 2 or 3 stores in a particular community than on the larger employer. Larger employers will complain, I assume, but at the end of the day, they'll deal with what they have to deal with. They are big, fat, capital-intensive businesses with huge marketing budgets.
I'll ask, this is the last question. I know my colleagues have some questions as well. As I was reviewing the materials for the wage board that was convened recently, and you look at some of the statistics that existed there, and I certainly suggest that whoever's interested should go back and take a look at it. They looked at the number of employees for fast food franchises. So those franchises that had fewer than 10 employees, those that had between 10 and 20, those that had over 100, and they gave the average salaries that were paid to their employees given the number of employees that they had. And what you'll find is that the larger ones, those that had more than 100 employees or more than 500 employees, were actually paying their workers over $15 an hour. And those that had fewer employees, they were small franchisees, the kinds that we were discussing just now, were actually on the lower end of the scale. So the larger companies have an opportunity by that, and I'll extrapolate, to be able to support the higher wage. So I appreciate that. Okay. Senator Savino.
Thank you, Senator Martins. Thank you, E.J. McMahon. I might not always agree with your findings, but I certainly have great respect for the work that your center does and the thought-provoking information that you bring forward. So I want to go to a couple of points that you made. Because I've read in other articles where you've talked about the EITC, and I think you're right. I think regardless of what happens with minimum wage here in New York State, I think it's time for us to re-examine whether the EITC really is a valuable tool for working families and what we can do to prop it up. So can you expand a bit more? Are you suggesting that we shouldn't raise the wage, we should spend more time focusing on how to make the EITC a more valuable tool for working families?
Well, first of all, I think there is no question that it is a valuable tool. I think one of the things that we haven't done certain state-focused work on it. We have an exceptionally large number of people in New York State who claim the EITC. Is, are there better delivery mechanisms? Are there, how and whether we can enhance it, again, for single individual workers, and how you would distinguish between individual workers who are college students over the summer and but maybe have claimed emancipation to get a loan, and individual workers who are trying to support themselves solely. There's all these sorts of questions. These are questions that have come up with the EITC in the past. I do think that, first of all, the EITC should not be overlooked, which it has been, I think, in general, is almost always overlooked in this discussion. The implication in this discussion always is that people out there are supporting families purely on the wage, without any other cash. And there is cash, and it's not. Public assistance is the wrong name for the Earned Income Tax Credit. Public assistance is standard welfare. The Earned Income Tax Credit is earned. And the same goes for the child credit, which goes to people way up most taxpayers up the income scale get the tax credit, get the child credit. So you're being treated the same as anybody else. But I think we need to look at it. I think we need to do the kind of research that you can do only if you have access to the state tax department's records, and do some blind research involving a comparison both of people in TANF, welfare to work programs, and the EITC rolls. I think there's not enough we know about how effective it is. I don't think enough recent research has been done to actually talk to families who get the EITC to find out what the strengths and weaknesses are. And again, to focus in particular, not just on the levels, but on the delivery mechanism. Should there be a regional difference in the EITC is another issue. So I think there's a lot of interesting questions surrounding the EITC that really we haven't asked, and that you need a government entity to sponsor those questions in order to get into the data at the level you need.
Right. You also brought up the issue of using the example of child care workers, that if we were to raise the minimum wage for workers everywhere, they would also be entitled to an increase in the minimum wage. But that's also a group of workers for whom the majority of their income is capped based on the subsidy that a working family has to obtain that child care.
Right.
So a lot of them are, their income is depressed simply by government policies.
Right.
So would you think it might be a good idea for us to revisit the subsidy rate for child care?
Well, I think that an honest way of approaching it, and I respect the way you've been talking about this, is because what you're implicating is, well, if we want to do this, we're going to have to spend a ton more money. I mean, basically, that's the implication of what you're saying, and the answer is yes. If you believe wholeheartedly in this, and I do think the economic consequences throughout the private sector economy, direct and ripple effects, will be more negative than you can stand. But if you were just looking at the impact on public sector budgets and confronting it honestly, as I think you're doing, is you have to recognize that there are untold hundreds of millions of dollars in costs associated with the wage levels now paid to employees of nonprofits, many of whom don't make, I'm just barely getting up to $9 an hour, much less 15, and that there's been no talk of that. I think when you really dig into the expense of that, I think it's going to be very large, perhaps shockingly large. And remember, let's say we ignored that, even though we should. Let's say you adopted this and ignored that. And you, as you point out, there's caps. Well, remember, this becomes the prevailing wage. So the nonprofit program is employing the person whose wage is capped, and the commercial child care center or the child care center that doesn't have subsidized clients is not capped. So that person now can get a job at another place that is required to pay more. This is how it can disrupt labor markets. It's also why, to make I think is an important point, when you begin to hear about and get documentation of the impact on nonprofits, and I think also probably the impact on small business, I think the natural first tendency of the legislature is to say we need carve-outs. We got to slow the schedule down, we got to carve out, we have to exclude, we have to have training wage. The problem is, if this minimum wage increase is to have any meaning at all of the sort you ascribe to it, it's going to affect labor markets. Just because I have a carve-out doesn't mean I'm going to be in danger of losing employees or having wage pressure because of the places that don't have a carve-out. So there are those effects, and I do respect what you're doing, which is to at least try to call attention to the fact that there are tremendous costs with this, particularly to those services that are subsidized, human services that are subsidized by government.
Thank you. I have two more questions, and I'll be very quick. even though we don't have a proposal before us, we assume we know what we're talking about based on, rallies that have been held and public comments that the governor has made, and we can look at the wage board and the action that they were asked to take, and I think what the governor has proposed for SUNY and some other state employees. So we think we know what we have, but we don't have a bill. But part of the discussion publicly that has been made in an effort to blunt the impact, so to speak, on businesses and small businesses has been a suggestion that perhaps the state should provide a tax cut to small businesses. What's your opinion on that? I don't have an opinion on it.
Whatever other reason there would be for doing a tax cut for small businesses, this is not the one.
Mm-hmm.
This is not apples to oranges. This is like apples to mangoes or palm trees. I mean, you're talking again,
Mm-hmm.
wage costs, and it varies depending on the type of businesses. But wage costs are part of gross expense. Your taxes is applied to your net income. Businesses, you're talking about businesses in many cases with margins, basically their profit or income margins of 1% to 4%, to which we then apply a 6.5% maximum tax rate, or varying depending on the income tax. So you're talking about a small percentage of a small percentage. The labor cost is the gross above the line expense. You can construct many models of a small business, defined as in the governor's new small business tax cut, for instance. A small business with, say, 50 or 60 employees, which has average wages of, say, $50,000, $55,000, including some people who are clustered in low-wage jobs just above the minimum wage at the bottom. When you apply this to that business's wage costs, that business may have net income of $200,000 taxable. Mm-hmm. It has wage costs of millions of dollars, $2 or $3 million. And you're increasing the wage costs, which may be $2 or $3 million, by, let's say, on average, because they're not all minimum wage, 10 or 20%. Well, 10 or 20% of $2 or $3 million is more than your entire net income. So there is no way this one thing relates to the other. Mm-hmm. It's not even worth thinking about. I mean, you do a minimum wage increase, and frankly, I was united with some of the people in this room who are normally we disagree on minimum wage. When the small minimum wage tax credit was enacted several years ago, people on both sides, we all spoke at it and said, this is a bad idea. This is not, this is counterproductive. It's pointless. Don't do it. It was done anyway, but I mean, I don't think you should even think about it.
And no one claimed it either. It's amazing.
Yeah, because it was pointless. I mean, not surprised, but I mean, if it had been more generous, if it had been generous enough a claim, it would have had counterproductive, unintended consequences that you wouldn't like. Mm-hmm. So it was not this. I wouldn't even think about it.
And I have one. Thank you for that. I have one final question. One of the reasons why this is very contentious, minimum wage. Right. I've been in the legislature now since 2005, and I think the 2004 cycle was a big fight over whether we should raise the minimum wage then to, I think, $6 an hour. And we've done it 3 times since then, but it's always difficult, and it's, and the same arguments come forward that, employers can't handle it, and it'll harm workers, it'll eliminate jobs at the low end, all of the arguments we're going to hear today, writ large, again. But here we are, trying to discuss it. So in your opinion, as an economist,
I'm not an economist.
An expert at these things.
Okay.
In your opinion, since it's taken 85 years almost for the minimum wage in the United States to go from 25 cents an hour to $7.50, 85 years, right? Would it be better if we took the politics out of it, if we eliminated this, and we were to raise the wage, establish a base floor that provides a living wage, that provides predictability for employers so that they know what they're facing, and then peg it to the rate of inflation?
Well, a lot of people have advocated that. There's not broad agreement on, but a lot of people who are for a higher federal minimum wage have advocated that. I would note that none of the most serious advocates of that have talked about going to 15 and indexing it. But yes, that's been a serious proposal. I don't think I'm misspeaking. I think even Mitt Romney supported indexing the minimum wage.
Imagine that.
But not 15. I think that the other thing we should be conscious of, though, again, which I think is getting more sort of belated recognition from those economists who are writing about raising the federal minimum, is recognizing the regional differentials, because they've looked at Seattle and said, Seattle's like this bubble of wealth creation right now. It's booming. It's filled with people going out to dinner, basically, allegedly. Well, Binghamton is not Seattle. You know, Elmira is not Seattle. And that, I think there's also, if you were thinking about automatic ratcheting devices, that you, not necessarily endorsing that idea, but getting at what you're getting at, if you're thinking of let's just do it one and done, let's just do something and ratchet it, you also ought to be thinking about regional wage norms and not simply having statewide ratcheting devices in a state as large and diverse as New York.
Well, I thought that was the last one, but I'm on that point. While there are different wage rates by state, recognizing New York's more expensive than Nebraska, and the feds set the real floor, we set our own ceiling here, or our own wage floor, which is whatever. Has there ever been an experience where a state has more than one minimum wage within
Yes.
their state?
New Mexico does, for instance. They're all high, and New Mexico is a very sick puppy.
They're all high, as in?
They're all high minimum wage. Well, no, they're not high in that. You're thinking of other legislative battles. They had extremely high minimum wages. In fact, Santa Fe was the only place you can find in the country that in one fell swoop went quickly on a percentage basis as much higher as the feds as this would take us about 10 years ago. The very poor, the New Mexico economy has performed very poorly. It has a variety, I think much of the state has different minimum wages, highest in Santa Fe. They're all higher than the federal minimum wage. They're all pretty high by national standards, and I don't think it's come out too well.
But the establishment of different wage rates within the state.
Oh, that's a pattern, yes, and there are, obviously it's happening in California now. Los Angeles is going to on its way to 15, state of Washington with Seattle. There are states that permit local minimum wages, yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I
Yeah,
have one.
I have a quick question.
Yes, Senator Marchione,
Okay,
and then we'll come to you, Senator.
Of course. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you, EJ, for your testimony today. Certainly can see that you have some serious concerns about $15 an hour, but would you have a suggestion or an alternative or a compromise that you think would work in New York and still help people perhaps have a higher minimum wage?
Well, putting aside the fact that I wouldn't advocate necessarily any increase in minimum wage, or rather than looking at a pause, at least now, after the increases we've had. So I'm not advocating it. However, I think that actually, that we were just leading to this, I think Senator Savino had the better approach last year, which was the fair local wage bill, which would allow New York City and counties in New York State to set wages. And as I pulled out your memo of justification because I thought it made some points that are still very valid, relevant to this debate, which was, first of all, that it would have recognized as you put it, the wide variation in the cost of living in different parts of the state, which has not been recognized in this discussion. Secondly, you wouldn't have the state completely evaporate from the discussion because you would basically peg what localities could do to some maximum percentage of what the state set, which in your bill was 30% above.
Right.
Which I think was 1170 or something. But I think that if you have to do anything, or you want to consider doing anything, I think that is a far better approach that allows local communities and local elected officials to recognize the dynamics of their own labor markets and to weigh all of the pluses and minuses. I think that's a far better approach. It was and it is than the approach we anticipate is going to be presented to you by the governor.
You don't feel that county by county is detrimental to the businesses that are there? That in Saratoga you'd pay, a certain amount, and in Albany you'd pay a different amount?
Well, I think what we'd quickly find out is I think the counties would quickly learn what kind of difference it made. I think that they would have to think about that in setting their wages. My prediction, based on nothing but hunch, is that very few would move far out of line with many others outside of New York City. But you would have a discussion that was far more relevant to and grounded in local reality than we're having now, which frankly, with all due respect for people in this room, has been carried out largely with references to McDonald's in Midtown Manhattan. And that is not relevant to a situation with nearly 50% of the hourly wage earners in the southern tier.
Thank you.
Thank
Senator
you.
Perkins.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much for the work you're doing and being here today. You mentioned Alan B. Kruger,
Yes.
and as a former advisor to Barack Obama.
Right.
Are you implicating that Barack Obama subscribes to the points of view that you or Mr. Kruger have on this?
Wouldn't firm, I'm not sure where he's standing. I think he's proposed a $12 federal minimum wage, and members of his administration have been in the neighborhood of this proposal, so I'm not sure what he
Okay,
supports.
just wanted to be sure that
Right. No, I'm not,
that he's
I
on that
wouldn't,
slippery slope.
I wouldn't dare imply anything as being the president's position.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.